Yeah. So I just wanted to, right off the bat, just huge thanks to those guys. So hopefully you guys enjoy this research, this presentation today. It's something I've been working on for a fair number of months at this point. My name is Josh Grunzweig. I'm a malware reverser at a company called Palo Alto Networks. I'm specifically in a group called Unit 42. For those that aren't maybe familiar with us, we are essentially the threat intelligence arm, wing, whatever you want to call it, within the organization. We're given a lot of freedom and autonomy in what we research, and I've been with the group for about 3 years now. So, as I said, I'm given a lot of freedom. I'm very, very fortunate. In the past 8 or so years, I've been able to look at just a huge range of malware and related campaigns. I've looked at everything from very targeted, nation state, whatever you want to call it, campaigns. I've looked at very widespread commodity-based malware campaigns. I've looked at pretty much everything in between. So I guess to set the stage for today, what are we going to talk about? I do want to mention that I won't be talking about any JavaScript or web-based mining activity. Truthfully, that's a huge topic, and just for the sake of time, I really didn't find myself focusing much on that angle, so I'm not going to be talking about that today. So if you're really gung-ho about JavaScript and malware that, operates in the browser, I'm going to have to disappoint you. We're not going to talk about America's booming coal industry, even though this image is a little alluding to that fact. Instead, we're going to talk primarily, exclusively, about what I'm calling binary-based miners being delivered via malware. So a piece of malware that ultimately delivers and executes some executable file that mines a cryptocurrency. And the reason this talk really exists is because about 4 to 6 months ago, I was doing some research, as I do, and time again, I kept finding myself in this predicament where I was reversing some malware, I was looking at a new campaign, and it kept being a situation where a crypto miner was being delivered. And I said, what the heck's going on, Am I really just that lucky that I keep finding this stuff? Or is there some bigger trend at play? So I looked, and there is a trend, it seems. So this graph, just to put it into context, is not an instance of how many times we've seen malware. This is actually an instance of when a new malware sample is identified over time. At its peak, I think we saw about 14,000 new malware miners being delivered in a single day. And as you see, it's been pretty interesting the past month or two. So for today, what I'd like to cover, I do want to talk a little bit about some foundational, crypto 101 type stuff, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm going to talk a little bit, a little history lesson, why did this happen? A little bit about some case studies I've worked on, some research, and then I got some brand new research that I'm going to share with you guys today. You are probably the second audience ever to see it, and the other one was recorded, so you're like, I don't know, there's like 50 other people that have seen it before. And maybe a slide about defense. We'll see. So, basic stuff. What is cryptocurrency? Simply put, it is a digital, typically distributed currency that runs independently of any sort of central banking authority or government. And it's not the first to do this. There's like eGold and other things that are out there that have certainly done this in the past. But what really differentiates cryptocurrency, and the reason it's called cryptocurrency, is the fact that it uses encryption algorithms to ultimately verify transactions, but also, in many cases, to distribute those funds to the general public. So it really kicked off in 2009, right? Bitcoin was sort of the first to put all these concepts together in a way that worked. And it has since just grown substantially since then, both in general public awareness as well as in ultimately value. Last I checked, a single Bitcoin is worth about $9,300. And the timing of when Bitcoin started is really, really important. So 2009, most people in the audience probably remember it. There's a couple young folks, but I was graduating college at the time, and the economy was in the gutter, which is just a really fun combination. But there was a lot of lack of faith, I guess you can say, in traditional banking systems. You know, a lot of people were out there saying, the government's corrupt, we don't have faith that our money is safe. And so Bitcoin kind of started, and it caused a lot of pioneers at the time to really adopt it and really just take on this new concept that previously hadn't really been done before. And as I said, it's grown substantially since then. Last I checked, there's about 1,600 or so different cryptocurrencies out there, and they really range in many, many ways. The truth is most of those cryptocurrencies are garbage. They are pretty much scams, but there's a lot of honest and good people out there that are developing these new currencies, and there's a lot of good folks out there as well. They vary in a lot of ways. So on the mining side, which I'll talk about in just a minute, there's a lot of different hashing algorithms that are used. A lot of them have different attributes insofar as how they are designed from the ground up. There's certain cryptocurrencies that are designed with anonymity in mind, so making sure that folks can't necessarily track what transactions you might be making or how much money you possess, like Manero, which I'll be talking about a lot today. And ultimately, there's just a lot of differences. And the reason that's important is because when we talk about malware, when we talk about these bad guys mining cryptocurrency, those differences are very, very important because it really ultimately determines what cryptocurrencies are targeted and mined and which ones are ultimately left alone. Not all cryptocurrencies can be mined. There's a number of them out there that have either been pre-mined, meaning the coins are out there, there's no more to be made, or they use alternative techniques to verify transactions and distribute funds. So what's a miner, right? Like that's kind of it's in the title. So a miner is ultimately just a computer. It's just a machine. The concept of mining often has this sort of cloak and dagger, like people don't necessarily know what it is, but they know if they do it, they'll make some money. But truthfully, really at a high level, all that's happening is folks are in this perpetual race to try to brute force a hash. As I said, there's different algorithms that are used based on which cryptocurrencies are in play. But ultimately, folks are just tossing computing power, tossing hashing power at this problem, this race where they're trying to be the first to crack it, the first to brute force it. When they're successful in brute forcing it, two things happen. As I said, the new transactions are verified, so everyone's happy about that. And as an incentive, the person that wins that race is rewarded with, a few of those cryptocurrencies. As an example, so Bitcoin right now is typically mined around every 10 minutes. It's very much dependent on how many people are doing that at a given time, and a lot of it's also based on luck, but more or less every 10 minutes. And the winner, the reward currently is about, I believe it's 12.5 Bitcoin. So by exchange rates, it's about 100 grand. So there's a lot of money to be made if you're, out there mining successfully and winning that race more often than not. This really results in a lot of interesting situations where you've got folks like, not to single them out, but there's a lot of organizations and folks in China that have these huge farms, these huge warehouses just full of computers that are doing nothing else than just trying to win this race. It also means that as an individual, as a user, you're kind of at a disadvantage. I can't take my computer right here and mine and say, oh, I'm definitely going to win that race. No, I would probably never win it. And if I did, it would probably take years. So that really ultimately results in the concept of a mining pool. Before I do that, I'm adding this because Jessica at the keynote yesterday had this great GIF, and I was like, I got to steal it. So I'm adding this just for some visual eye candy, so my coworker Brad doesn't get bored. Also, if you're ever wondering why you can't buy a video card right now, which is what they're shoving at rocks, it's because certain cryptocurrencies like Ethereum really lend themselves to being mined via GPUs or video cards. So everyone's buying them and causing the price to skyrocket. It's also an important point to make that certain hashing algorithms really lend themselves to different types of devices. You know, Manero, for instance, really lends itself to CPU-based hashing versus Aetherium, which is really GPU-based. And there's also instances where specified, very specific machines are built with the sole concept of mining, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Back to my point, though, earlier. I'm by myself. I've got my laptop, my server at home, whatever. My odds of winning that race and getting that reward are very, very small, if anything. So this really very quickly, you know, spawned this idea of a mining pool. And the way I like to talk about it is really it's sort of this commune, right? You've got, let's say we all had our computers in the audience. We all banded together and decided we're going to act as one entity. If we are able to win that race, get that reward, based on how much effort everyone put in, you get your piece of the pie. Let's say I'm running the mining pool. I'm running the infrastructure. I take a little cut myself, 1 or 2%. The really nice thing about mining pools is that they not only provide the infrastructure to tie multiple miners together, but they also provide a consistent revenue stream because these pools have just a large amount of hashing power at their disposal. They've got hundreds of thousands of users all banding together, which results in them winning that race very, very frequently. So it means that you don't have to wait 2 years hoping to mine and win this race. You can simply join a pool and they're going to win it a lot. And every time that happens, you're getting a little, a little sliver, a little bit of money very consistently. Real quick, I just want to talk about ASIC devices because they really do play a role when it comes to malware mining activities. So an ASIC is simply just a very specialized device, a specialized computer that literally is designed from the ground up to only mine a specific hashing algorithm. They really have a drastic effect when they're released because they just completely saturate the market. These things can put out a lot of hashing power, like over 100 times what the traditional computer might be able to put out. And so when you've got hundreds of thousands of these entering the market, it causes traditional computers to almost be rendered obsolete. So when ASICs enter for a given cryptocurrency, enter the market, more often than not, you're going to see a drastic decline in malware targeting those currencies because there's just not that much money to be made. Case in point, an ASIC came out for Bitcoin, I think in 2013. The amount of Bitcoin miners we've seen recently is quite low. They're also out for a few other ones. Litecoin's got one. I think Siacoin Dash, I think, might have one as well. And there was one recently announced about a month ago for the CryptoNight algorithm, which is what Manero uses. But Manero is ASIC resistant, meaning they really don't like ASIC devices. So they changed their hashing algorithm and rendered all those ASIC devices pretty much obsolete. So that's kind of an interesting side story, which I won't get into. But needless to say, it's caused some weird tension in the crypto industry, I guess you call it. So let's put it all together. Hopefully you guys dig this slide because I spent a lot of time making an animation. I don't use PowerPoint that often. So, little hypothetical here. We've got the cryptocurrency network, and we've got these sort of 3 players that are each trying to successfully mine it. You've got Alice on the left, who's super rich, and she's got all these computers in her basement or her warehouse or wherever. You've got a mining pool in the center, made up of about 5 individuals, and then you've got Josh on the right, who's, he's maybe not the sharpest guy in the room, but he says, I'm going to give it a go. I got my one computer. I'm going to see what happens. And so as it goes, as the race is perpetually run, we see, as expected, Alice, who has the most hashing power, to ultimately win the race time and time again. In certain instances, we'll see the mining pool actually win, and in which case it is, again, disseminated based on how much effort the individual players put in. They get that little chunk of the reward. And then if we wait super long, well, relatively speaking, we might see Josh get lucky and actually get a reward himself. I made this animation a while ago. There we go. I couldn't remember. So that's like a super high level of how it works. Now imagine that there is not 3 players, but there is 3 million players all trying to do the same thing. And it makes for a really interesting environment. So let's talk history, I guess. It's like 6 months ago, so it's technically history, but not really. How did we find ourselves in this predicament where there's this huge spike in malware targeting cryptocurrency miners? So probably about close to a year now, something happened. We saw this weird decline at the time in ransomware. Everyone, I'm pretty sure in the room knows what ransomware is. It's really, really bad. But we saw a decline, which was really weird because why would that happen? You know, why would traditional systems, whether it be botnets or actors or whomever, malvertising, why would these traditional avenues of attack be all of a sudden shifting from ransomware to cryptocurrency miners? You know, there's some hypotheses out there. Maybe users got smarter. They said, hey, we're going to take backups and we're not going to click on those links. And maybe security vendors got smarter. You know, a lot of the security vendors out there, maybe mine, are putting out a lot of ransomware specific stuff. So maybe that really churned the tables and made the bad guys say, well, we're not going to do ransomware anymore. Most of that is BS. There's a child in the room, so I will not be swearing. Is BS. The truth is that the value of cryptocurrency just shot to the moon, as they say. It spiked drastically, and there's not really as far as I know, a perfect reason as to why. But all of a sudden, in like June of last year, a lot of the general public started to get wind of what this cryptocurrency thing was, specifically Bitcoin. And they said, I can't miss out on this ride. I got to make some money. So they start investing and telling others who then had that same reaction. It was a weird, like, self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. But ultimately, at the end of last year, the value of Bitcoin was something around like 20K. It was very, very high. And wow, that's a really small font. Other currencies followed suit. So I've included Manero, Litecoin, Aetherium. I even included Ripple, which is probably not the smartest decision because it's just that red line at the bottom. But it went from like 10 cents to like $3.30. Like if I zoomed in, you guys would be like, wow, that was super impressive. But yeah, all these cryptocurrencies values just like shot through the roof. And so it had a really interesting effect on the malware space because, well, I think of it as a few ways, right? So obviously the bad guys are going after where the money is. If they say, I can consistently make money mining cryptocurrencies, I'm going to do that. It's less invasive. It probably doesn't tick people off as much. There's less chance of me getting arrested, that sort of thing. But also when you think about just the crazy volatility of cryptocurrencies, you got to think that has some sort of an impact on the ransomware space. I mean, you know, my Aunt Sue gets infected on Monday. She's asked to pay $500 in Bitcoin. By the end of the week, she has taken out that Bitcoin and for whatever, like, let's just assume that she's able to do that. She's taken out this Bitcoin. She's ready to pay. By Friday, the value is now doubled or halved or whatever. It's drastically changed, causing a lot of, either good for her or good for the bad guys. It's hard to say. It also probably impacts her willingness to pay the ransom. So, yeah, there was a lot of reasons as to why this change occurred. But truthfully, I mean, it was just this huge spike in value. Everyone wanted their piece of the pie. All the bad guys wanted to make some money. So let's talk about a few use cases. Over the past 3 to 6 months, I've researched a few interesting campaigns. I've kind of picked a couple to discuss today. So the first one is one that I've entitled Pickaxe. my coworkers wanted me to call it, was it black lung or something? Something I wasn't really down with. But at a high level, what Pickaxe is simply a campaign that originates via malicious advertising or malvertising. It delivers a self-extracting executable, which in turn persists via a link file in the startup folder. But it ultimately delivers a series of VBS files or VB scripts with some URL redirection thrown into the mix, and ultimately delivers XMRig, which is a completely legitimate, benign miner for Manero, but it is, in this case, used maliciously. So there's about 333 samples that I found, ultimately, which comes into play later. But on the malvertising part of it, on the initial infection vector. So in this case, it used a platform called Adfly, which some folks in the audience might be familiar with. Quick show of hands, Adfly, people use it. It's used a lot in, what's that?
Yeah, I use it a lot. Sometimes it's used as download links, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's used
Yep.
links, so mainly downloads.
It's usually used for, not to single you out because I use it too, less than legitimate files. It's essentially a URL redirection service married with an advertising platform. So there's two sides to it, right? If I want to make a few bucks, I create a URL shortened link, and I get as many people as I possibly can to click on it. Each time they click on it, I get a little, fraction of a cent or something. Conversely, if I want to advertise my content, which, as far as I can tell, is almost always malware, but if I want to advertise my content, I pay like $1 and I get 1,000 views. If I want to get fancy and have it really specific to certain regions, I can pay a few more dollars, but it's a very cheap barrier to entry, I guess you'd say. And typically the way it works is something like this. So I am perusing the internet. I am very poor, and I Google, how can I get Counter-Strike Global Offensive for free? I stumble on this wonderful YouTube video that tells me exactly how to do it, which in turn has a series of links to various files that I can in turn download. All these links, as you can see, are Adfly links. Clicking on one will give you something that looks kind of like this. So at the top header, that's benign, I guess you could say. That is the Adfly header. There is a 5-second counter that ultimately results in that skip ad at the top right. But pretty much everything under that header is the quote-unquote advertisement. In this case, it is a fake Flash Player update, which is very popular. In other cases, it might be a fake download manager or, whatever. Anything to get the user to ultimately click on that embedded iframe. So, as I said, this is sort of how the users are initially infected. They're ultimately delivered a self-extracting executable, which in turn drops and runs a VBS file that looks very, very similar to this. As you can see, very basic obfuscation. They split up save to file. That was about it. But really all it's doing is just downloading and executing one additional VBS file, which the link to which is at the top. Looking at that VBS file, we see it's a little bit more fancy. They're actually looking at what the processor is on the victim, whether it's 32-bit or 64-bit, and they've got two bit.ly links. Bit.ly is a URL shortener. I'm sure most people are familiar with it. They've got two bit.ly links at the front hallway there. It's totally legitimate service. I worked with the guys over there for a while now. I got nothing but good things to say. Unfortunately, once in a while their platforms get abused, but it is by and large typically used for benign purposes. In this case, they've got two bit.ly links, one in case it's 64-bit, one in case it's 32-bit. And then they are running the payload that gets downloaded via PowerShell. Two things I want to call out, or maybe it's a couple things. So after they download and execute it, you can see a number of command line arguments. So there's -o f.pooling.cf, There's -U. There is also max CPU usage. So the -O is just pointing it at a mining pool. As I said, criminals and good guys alike typically use them. The -U is the user, which in this case is just sort of a placeholder type of thing, but oftentimes you'll see an actual wallet address being used or an email address. That's going to come into play later. And max CPU usage. So I'll talk a little bit about defense in a bit, but ultimately people think of crypto miners as like, oh, it's going to use 100% CPU usage. My computer's going to go, bananas, and I'm going to find it right away. The bad guys aren't necessarily idiots. They know this too. And so in this case, they're actually throttling it to only use 20%. Now, the fact that it used Bitly was super interesting to me because I and anyone can ultimately get statistics on who clicked on those links. Now, that Bitly link is so far down the chain that every time someone is accessing it, you can almost explicitly say that they've been compromised. So all in all, I had like 30 to 40 Bitly links that I'd accrued. Only about a third of the samples actually used Bitly out of the 333 samples I'd collected. And so I pretty much scraped all these pages to come up with all the victims. So when it was all said and done, there were 15 million people that got infected that I knew of. As I said, it represented about a third of the overall number of samples I collected. So you could probably guess that it was probably in the 30 to 45 million numbered range when it came to victims. I am going to go a little quicker because I gave this talk like 2 weeks ago, and I went through it in like 35 minutes, so it's only proper that I would go 30 minutes over this time around because apparently I can't figure this out. But BTOR, I don't have a clever name for this one. It is a Russian BitTorrent site. It is still out there. You can still check it out. I translated it for you guys because I didn't think you guys spoke Russian. I don't. It came out in June of last year. And it's good. It's got like 250,000 BitTorrent files. But back in September, something really interesting happened. So when a user clicked on this download torrent link at the bottom right for a given file, a given torrent, they were not given a torrent. They were instead given a zip file, which was named like the torrent. In this case, it's World of Warcraft, so it would be named like worldofwarcraft.torrent.zip. The zip file had an executable in it, which had a little uTorrent logo to try to make it again look like a torrent file. Once again, worldofwarcraft.torrent.exe. And then once that exe was run, it actually did download and execute the real torrent, but next to that, it also dropped and executed a .NET payload, which did a few things and ultimately delivered, again, XMRig. So I didn't have a lot of telemetry on this one. I can't say, millions of people got infected, but I did want to bring it to your attention because I thought it represented a really unique method that this stuff is being distributed. This owner of this torrent site is actually Trojanizing his own files to his users to try to earn a little extra, money on the side. And the last example I want to talk about is a relatively new one within the last month or so called Rarog. Rarog is actually a malware family that's sold and distributed on various Russian underground forums. It's typically sold by this dude that goes by the username ArsonKoo135, and it's pretty nice. It's got like a nice web interface, and they've got a demo admin panel that you can check out and sort of try before you buy. Cost 6,000 rubles, so like $100. And you can't see it because it's super small, but at the top right it says developed by Foxovsky. And then at the top left it says to buy Rarog, reach out to, again, ArsonKoo135. So it looks really nice, but the web panel security is not super great. Was able to, through a trusted source, I was able to look at about 60 to 80 C2 databases and map out where the victims were. What was super weird was like most of the victims were in Russia. So the unwritten rule, as many people in the room know, if you want to do bad things in Russia, that's fine as long as you don't, go after your countrymen, go after fellow Russians. So while the guys that developed this, I found out were Russian, while they weren't necessarily targeting these users, they were selling the malware that was. So I have to wonder if something might ultimately result as because of that. So about 160,000 infections, not nearly as bad as Pickaxe, but pretty substantial nonetheless. Specifically, I want to go back to this slide that I showed you early on. So this was pretty much just a representation of our data set at Palo Alto Networks. I sought out all the miners I could find, delivered, as I mentioned, via binary. And so when it was all said and done, I had about 470,000 samples. I mean, I'm a malware guy. I'm a researcher. I said, what can I do with this? I was like, it'd be super cool if I just analyzed them all and looked at them all and pulled out interesting artifacts, whether it be cryptocurrencies being mined, wallet addresses, email addresses, any artifacts I could find. So that's what I did. We are fortunate at Palo Alto Networks. We've got a cloud-based sandbox. So I took all these sandbox reports that we had. I took PCAP's data that I had, and I ultimately just scripted the heck out of it over the course of a couple weeks, just fine-tuning this really hacky long script I wrote to extract, as I said, wallets, what currencies are being targeted, what mining pools are being used, that sort of thing. And at the end, I had a really big CSV file, and I was super happy. When it was all said and done, I had, as I said, about 470,000 samples that I had successfully identified, not only as being miners, but was able to identify what was being mined, for the most part. I was able to get about 3,100 email addresses, 2,700 mining pools, and then various wallets. I added Aetherium because, like I said earlier, it's used primarily via video cards, so I just thought it was really bizarre and interesting to see that particular currency being targeted, because it's I don't know, it was surprising, to say the least. So, taking a step forward, the breakdown, it's pretty much all Manero. 82% of all the samples are targeting Manero, which for anyone that looks at this stuff really shouldn't surprise you at all, but it's kind of interesting to actually see it on a colorful pie chart. And there's a few reasons. As I said, it's ASIC resistant, so and it's primarily targeted or used, it's primarily mined via CPUs, which is perfect when you're talking about compromising end users' machines. It's also very anonymous, meaning it's very difficult to determine, where the money is going ultimately. So I looked at Bitcoin first. It's the big player. You got to look at it, right? I looked at the 1,000 or so wallets that I had, and I ultimately just tried to determine how much money was made. Now, I'll be the first to tell you my methodology was a little bit flawed on this one, because literally all I did was just check the blockchain and see how much money had entered these wallets. But as folks in the audience probably know, that's not great, because what if those wallets are being used for other legitimate purposes, or what if they're also pushing out ransomware and that's being paid into it? But ultimately, it's just really difficult to determine when money was going into those accounts via mining only. And the main reason is because of mining pools. A lot of times this stuff had been mined years ago via mining pools that no longer exist. And so to determine and to track down where all the money originated from is a very difficult thing. That being said, I found about 2,600 Bitcoin that had been paid into these 1,000 or so wallets. The top earners, 279, 242, 214, some decent money. So about 21 million, and this is actually a lower estimate because it's using $8,000 as a conversion. It's, like I said, around 9,300 right now. So it's probably close to 26 or so. But still, some good money was potentially made. I then looked at Manero, which was much trickier because you can't just simply check the blockchain and see how much money a wallet made. But I remembered that the majority of these mining pools that the bad guys are using do allow you to anonymously view statistics. So you just plug in the wallet, and if that person has mined to that pool before, you can get a great breakdown of, their current hash rate, their, current amount that they have mined and made, and how much money they've historically made. So I took the top 9 or so mining pools that allowed you to anonymously view them. I took my 2,000 wallet addresses, and I just checked everything. And what I came up with was, I think, kind of interesting. 782,000 Manero, and also the methodology on this one's obviously going to be a lot more accurate. So this is mining only. This is not going to be riddled with ransomware. It's not going to be riddled with legitimate stuff. This is instances where money is being mined only to wallets that have been seen in malware samples. This number also represents 5% of all the Manero in the world. This, again, isn't accounting for JavaScript or web-based stuff. It's also not accounting for things I haven't seen. I've only got, my sliver of insight into this particular threat. But it's pretty substantial. Again, this is the low end, 200. It's probably close to 250, 260. So you're probably looking at around $200 million, with the top earners making, 10 million or more. I should also point out that these wallets aren't necessarily tied to individuals. There could be one guy that owns all these wallets, or there could be one organization that owns them all. Or one wallet could be used for, multiple individuals. But at the end of the day, a lot of money is being made. I also, as I said, could query the hash rate. So I was curious there too. So I queried all the hashes of these various wallets and found about 10 million hashes per second globally, which represents about 13 grand a day being made, and about 1% of the total mining power for Manero. If we look at a couple use cases, so this is a graph of one wallet's mining rate over time. So how many guesses he's making in a given day, essentially. This is one of the biggest ones I'd seen, with a hash rate of about 1 million at its peak. But what's really kind of interesting to me is this sort of flow that you see. And in addition to that, this sort of downward trend over time. So I still don't know exactly why this flow occurs. My theory, my hypothesis is that the malware is configured to only run during inactive times. So when you look at the global number of victims that this person has, certain people are falling asleep, certain people are, coming online, and it might account for this sort of consistent flow. You can also obviously see when a new campaign started, because the hash rate went from 0.6 million to, just over 1 million in about a day. And at the very bottom, you can see this guy made about 1,000 Manero, or about 250 grand, based on today's exchange rates. Looking at other instances, we see that similar trend, that similar wavy spike and general decline over time, meaning people are finding malware on their systems and cleaning them. So the general hash rate is going to decline. This was part of a rig exploit kit campaign. And what was really bizarre too is it just died one day. I don't know if the infrastructure was taken down or what, but you'll see in early April it's just gone. It's done. This is a different mining pool, so it looks a little different, but that same sort of flow. Same sort of patterns. They don't always look like that though. So here's another example. This guy made about 500 grand, about 2,000 Manero, but it looks much more legitimate. Like if I were to run a miner on my computer, it would look like this. I have, not on this one, but I have done it in the past, and it looks a lot like that. So they're not always super easy to identify, but there are signs in certain instances. Let's talk a really quick minute about defense. It's not super easy. So you think crypto miners, you think, all right, I'm going to look for computers that CPU spike to 100%, and I'm going to find them all, and like game over, it's done, right? But the truth is, as I've shown, a lot of times these guys are throttling it. A lot of times they are only running them at certain periods of time. I've seen instances where they will actually look at keyboard movements or mouse or keyboard clicks and mouse movements. And if they see someone's actively on the system, they will shut off mining operations. Rarog had a neat feature where you could supply a series of of processes to essentially blacklist. So these were like really high intensive processes like Photoshop or various video games. And if those are running, the mining just stops in its tracks. So they do a lot of different techniques to try to prevent it from being super obvious that a miner is running. On the network side, you could try to, I guess, look for the Stratum protocol, which is pretty consistently used for a lot of these mining pools. If you're able to identify it, you could, take action there and try to block it, or at least identify which host might be running a miner. But yeah, I mean, this stuff is distributed in so many different ways that unfortunately there's just really not like a silver bullet. And I wish there was, because I feel like that'd be much better to say right now. But unfortunately, it's just the way it is. Like, traditional security practices, defense in depth, whatever you want to call it, really is the only great way to go at this problem. I actually timed it pretty good. So I have a couple minutes, I think. I'm going to open up to questions in case anybody has any. Yeah.
So how do you protect yourself when you're doing this research? You seem to be pretty far out there as far as the investigative side.
So how I protect myself? I assume you mean like to keep the bad guys from like doxing me and going after me? That's a great question, and one I should probably have a good answer for. I mean, I take some basic precautions. I have two-factor on like a lot of stuff, and I make sure, unique passwords and all those sort of best practices you assume people are going to be taking. But no, I mean, truthfully, I do put myself out there a little bit, and hope that guys videotaping me don't videotape me when I ask them to, and that sort of thing, and try not to tick off the bad guys too much. So far, as far as I know, it's been okay. Are you going after me? Are you trying to get like info on me? Like he's like, oh, two-factor. Yeah.
No, I'm on the .gov side. You don't have to worry about it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah.
So how can like the average user defend themselves against these sorts of attacks? I know that sounds like a dumb question, like, oh, just use Adfly, oh, just use this program. But what can the average user do, like, without having to purchase like sort of like?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what can the average user do to protect themselves? Like I said, it's just general best practices when it comes to security. I mean, in truth, this really isn't that different when it comes to ransomware or any of these other big threats, banking Trojans, what have you, as to how they get on the systems. Patching, making sure you've got, some host-based or network-based firewall, making sure antivirus is up to date, what have you. Just general security hygiene. Yeah, maybe don't go to Russian BitTorrent sites, or at least don't download any. Yeah.
Jason, great talk, first of all.
Thanks.
I think the numbers on the ransomware were a lot higher than I expected.
On the miners, yeah.
But did you compare it to what a similar campaign might be getting ransomware? Like, did these guys make a good economic decision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a fair question. So the question is, compared to ransomware, how does mining stack up? Are these guys making more money, less money? In a lot of ways, unfortunately, it's kind of comparing apples to oranges, because a lot of times the miners are much more long-term in how long they run. So the guys that are making, 10 million, they've been mining for like years. It's not like they just jumped in a couple months ago and they're just raking in the dough. They've been at it for a long, long time. Conversely, ransomware is sort of a really quick, infect them, make sure they know they're infected, and hope that they pay you back. So it's a much more high risk, high reward, more immediate payback. So I wish I had a good answer for you on that one. But unfortunately I just don't. Yeah.
So your slide for the infection by country for Pickaxe, I was surprised at how low the number of infections in the US was compared to a lot of countries that I would consider not to be very well.
Yeah, so I think my theory on that, so the question is, Pickaxe had very few infections in the United States. That's kind of weird, right? My theory is the guys that did it, via Adfly and stuff were cheap. And if you want to target more US-based citizens, it costs more money. It costs, instead of $1, it costs like $4 or something. So my suspicion is they didn't necessarily care geographically where the victims were. They just were trying to spend as little money as possible for the initial compromises. And in which case that usually does tend to focus on that sort of southeast region and whatnot. That's my guess. I don't know for sure, but yeah.
So mining itself is a legitimate service.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, so the question is, mining itself is legitimate, right? And it is. I've mined, I know a lot of people that have. It's totally legitimate to do that. The problem, as you stated, is how the malware or how the miners are being delivered and ultimately run without the victim's knowledge. This is why I have a big problem with things like CoinHive and some of these JavaScript-based things that are ultimately just run in the background because the user doesn't know what they're signing up for, So I think it's more not so much the payload, it's how the payload got there, and the fact that it's distributed via malware without the user's consent or knowledge is honestly the real problem. Yeah, and also the victims don't get any money, so the bad guys get like free power and free resources for ultimately nothing. Yeah.
You mentioned difficulties in blocking this type of attack or prevention. Is blocking mining pools at the edge something that's effective, or will it change to rapidly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Ben asked, can you block mining pools at the edge? Is that going to be a valid approach? In a lot of cases, it could be. There's also instances where you can run proxy services. So I didn't mention it, but in Pickaxe, they're actually using XMRig proxies to connect to. So if you were to block the big mining pools, the ManeroHash.com and ManeroPool.com and these guys, they would just simply use, in a lot of cases, these proxy services to sort of circumvent it. But as I said, if you can identify the underlying network traffic, if you're able to do that, that goes a long way in not only identifying this activity, but potentially blocking it as well. Which isn't always the easiest thing, but if you do have that ability, it probably goes a long way. Yeah?
What do you think the likelihood of these mining pools going mobile?
So the question is, what is the likelihood of the mining pools going mobile? Do you mean like the miners themselves running on mobile devices? I think that's a fair point. I think that's a possibility, but the thing also you got to think about is battery life, right? So whenever you're talking mobile, battery life comes into play. And if you're mining on your Google Pixel, whatever, your Apple iPhone, that's going to kill the battery pretty quick. And I suspect that's going to alert people to something being wrong or at least off. So again, these guys are in it for the long haul in a lot of cases. They're not necessarily looking to get caught for years, if at all. So I think that's a fair possibility, but the reality is I don't think we'll technically probably see that anytime soon. At least with the current, I can't barely get a full day charge on this thing without Monero miners. Yeah, so that's a possibility too. They could look for, making checks to see if the charger is plugged in and then mine. There's possibilities. There's possibilities for sure. Just depends how creative the bad guys want to get, or you if you're so inclined. Which maybe is why you asked. I don't know. Yeah.
So the network traffic that goes out to miners for specific Bitcoins, does it always go out at the same port? Does it go out to ports? Is there a way?
So the network traffic on that side of things, the question is, what ports and stuff does it use? It varies, different ports. The underlying traffic is essentially just TCP though, and it uses like a JSON-based communication protocol. They say it's Stratum, and I think it is technically, but usually it's depending what cryptocurrency you're looking at, it tends to vary slightly. So there are some nuances depending if you're seeing someone mine Ethereum versus Bitcoin versus Manero or whatever the case may be. So there is some variance there.
So the traffic going out from the miner, to follow up on that question, it's just a message. It's not a payload on the way out.
It's just a message.
It's like a text notification.
It's a JSON blob, and not a very big one to boot. It's usually just like a few hundred characters back and forth. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm all out of time, but I appreciate you guys coming today. Thank you so much for your time.